Hello, everybody. This is Ed with another episode of Call Me Mr. Broadstreet. As my very special guest today, of course, I have both Jude Southerland Kessler and Scott McKinley. Jude has just written the fifth volume in the John Lennon series, Shades of Life. So this is part five here. As we're plugging away, and Scott has done some of the voice work over for it as well. So just go ahead and do a quick introduction if you want to. I could start either or, whoever wants to start first.
Okay, well, I'm Jude Southerland Kessler. I'm the author of the John Lennon series. This is coming up on May 1st. It will be my 38th year of researching John's life and going to Liverpool 7 times to interview everybody over there, interviewing everybody that I could find here, like journalists that traveled with the Beatles and people who introduced the Beatles and people who interviewed them for radio, reporters. So I've 37 years, at least 7 days a week, some weeks 8. I've been obsessively John Lennon. And the John Lennon series, if you're not familiar with it, is composed of right now 5, soon to be 6 mammoth books. This one is She Loves You, the one that we'll be talking about a lot tonight, which starts in May of 1963 and ends at the end of February 1964. So that's just that time frame. It's not even quite a year. So they're very in the weeds. There are 4,400 footnotes in that book. So you're getting exactly what the Beatles said, ate. I mean, there are controversies about what they ate, what they wore, what they did, what they said, and how they recorded and everything. But you read it as if you were reading. It appears to be like a novel, but everything is documented, footnoted. In the early volumes, in volume 1, when John was a little boy or when John was in high school, I had to surmise what he said because no one knows. I mean, I might know that the headmaster called me and said John was failing miserably and that he was not doing well at school. That much I know. I know about the phone call, but I don't know what Mimi said, and I don't know what John said when Mimi confronted him with it. I do know what she was cooking because that's covered in one of the books. She was making steak and onions when the phone call came in, but I didn't have a lot of the details. But after 1961, everything they said is recorded. And fortunately, great people like John C. Wynne transcribed all the EMI tapes so you can get what they say in studio. And I try to lean heavily, very heavily on actual verbiage. But this is kind of a sample book. And it was my joy to meet Scott R. McKinley, who's with us tonight, about a year ago. It seems like we've been friends forever. It seems like it's been like 10 years or 20 years. But I'll say this and then I'll let him enhance it. He did the voice work for Lennon, the Mobster, and the Lawyer, this tremendous book by Jay Bergen. Now, if you are a Beatles fan, you're saying repeatedly, I wish there was new material. They keep saying never before heard, never before seen, but we've heard it and we've seen it. It's the same stuff. Not here, people. This is all new material from John's trial against Morris Levy, who, without John's permission, made the Roots album of the tapes for the rock and roll LP. And it is material that Jay Bergen, who is his attorney, kept to himself for years, finally released. This is all about John's concept of creativity, how he made an LP, how he ordered songs on the record. This is stuff that's never been read or heard before. And Jay auditioned, I'll let him tell you that whole story for this. He reached out to me when it came out and sent me a link. And I did not really do audiobooks, but I thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. I've never been impressed with I know so many talented people, musicians and artists and people who are really great. No one makes a story come alive, especially a Beatles story like Scott R. McKinley. I was like, I'm flabbergasted because he isn't pretending to be John Lennon. He isn't imitating John Lennon. He's John Lennon. And I'm picky about people that do John Lennon. But from there we got in touch with each other. But he's did a great job with this, and ended up after that, and I'll let him fill in all the pieces, but ended up that we tackled this book together with my husband, all three of us working on it. And it took us just about a year to make it into an audio book. But Scott, take it away. Tell them about the famous Jay Bergen audition and all that good stuff.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. Yes, my name's Scott McKinley. I'm an audiobook narrator and a voice actor. And I've only been doing this full time for about 3 or 4 years now. But I've always liked audiobooks or books on tape, as we used to call them back in the day. And I thought I could do a really good job on a Beatles type book. I've always wanted to hear it done well. And anyway, I was auditioning one night or looking through for new editions in Audible, as it happened. And suddenly a John Lennon book showed up by Jay Bergen. And they were looking for unexpected isn't, the right word for it. It just, that kind of thing almost never comes up for an audition for audiobooks. You're lucky to get a book that you'd read on any subject, much less something like the Beatles. So I'm primarily an audiobook narrator. I like history. I like fiction and science fiction, that kind of thing. But I've always been a Beatles fan for all of my life. And the chance to even audition for something Beatles related was something I knew I may never get another chance to again. And that some of the voice work I've been doing, jokingly doing Beatle voices in my pre-voiceover jobs, as any of my former coworkers could tell you, or answering the phone with a British accent, more or less when I knew who was on the other end, or a Scottish accent or something, but especially doing Beatle voices was special. Anyway, Bergen's publisher was asking for an audition only for someone who could do a passing imitation of John Lennon's voice, because it was courtroom scenes and courtroom testimony. And he didn't want to hear like so-and-so said, so-and-so asked. He wanted just to hear the back and forth with different enough voices that you could tell who's in the room. And for an important voice like John Lennon's, he only wanted professional people to be auditioning for it. So I dropped everything else that I was working on and auditioned for it. And I had a lot of fun doing the audition. And within a few hours, I actually heard back. It said like, don't do anything else. Obviously, this is very early into the audition process, but you're on the list. So hopefully, is it okay if you wait and all this? And anyway, long story short, I got the part. I was able to do it, provided I could do a few of the other people in the book. And I wasn't sure how good of a job I was doing. I don't know that many people in England, or at least back then I didn't. And just trying to get people to listen and maybe do a review, see how I was doing, and I knew that Jude had the reputation, and still does, of being the best John Lennon expert out there. I thought, geez, I don't know her, but maybe. So I sent her a message through Facebook on Messenger. I'm like, hey, I'm a new guy. I've got this thing. Can you just, if it's possible, here's a copy. Just take a listen and let me know what you think. You may not like it. It may not be, or you may be busy, but at least give me a couple pointers, which is what I asked. And then she got back, as she said before, and just knocked my socks off and said, like, it's good. It's good. Can we do something together when you have the time? And that's how we got started with doing She Loves You.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, well, so of course, She Loves You, and of course, the volume that I've also got. I actually had picked up the volume 5 with the 1965 right here, so we've got a couple things to definitely cover. I may be asking some questions as this, but certainly we can expand upon all the different volumes, all the different everything. And actually, that knocks off a few questions.
Yeah,
Like
Shades of Life.
how you first met, how the latest book and everything, and it is kind of interesting with the latest book, Jude. When I met you, of course. that volume, that particular one, not She Loves You, but the volume 5, going from January 1965 to August of 1965. So kind of just a little more in-depth question. Where did your kind of writing career start when you were starting all of these books in what I understand is a 9-volume series? Where did that all begin for you?
Well, I knew all of my life, even as a very young girl, that I wanted to write. And I decided by the time that I went to college a year early, and I knew by that point, I was 16 when I entered college, and I knew that I wanted to major in both history and English so that and research. I did a minor in research and went straight on into the master's program. And the same thing, that I want to write a book about someone written as a novel, but all documented and researched. So I was preparing myself to do that. And it took a few years, but by the time I was in my early 30s, I was getting ready to do this. And I said, who is it that I know enough about to dedicate that much time to writing a book about? I was like, oh, John Lennon. I know everything there is to know about John Lennon. I knew zero about John Lennon. I knew nothing. I mean, the stuff that you knew from fan magazines, and I started collecting. I wish I could show you this room, because on all sides we're surrounded by bookshelves of books. I probably have 500 books about John Lennon and the Beatles now. And I started collecting periodicals, and at that time it was audio tapes. You didn't have DVDs or anything like that, and anything I could get. And by the 1990s, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to do this unless I went to Liverpool, because I knew there was a Cavern Club, and I knew there was the Grapes, and I knew there was the Empire Theater. But where are they in relationship to each other? Do you turn right? Do you turn left? What do the streets look like? What does it smell like? What is it like in March? What's it like in November? What's it like in the summer? What landmarks do you see? What do the people sound like? What do they have on? And so I started saving. At times I would put $1.86 in the bank, and then $3 in the bank, and whatever I could save, I put it, and try to get enough money to go to Liverpool. And finally, for Christmas of 1992, my parents gave me the extra money that I needed to be able to go to Liverpool in 1993. And after that, I thought my husband wasn't going to be able to get me home. He actually sent a lady into the bathroom to come get me, because I wouldn't come. The lady comes in and says, your husband says you have to come out and you have to get on the plane. Like, no, I don't want to leave. But anyway, after that, we went to Liverpool every single year for 7 years, and conducted one interview in the morning, one interview in the afternoon, and one in the evening. And we tried to talk to as many people as we could who were actually there. I mean, people like Helen Anderson, John's best friend in college, and Colin Fallows, who knew everybody at the Blue Coat School, where Stuart at that time, they compiled all of Stu's information and kept all of Stu's information. And a lot of people there knew Stu, because Stu's crucial to the story. And it just started Nicholas Horsfield, one of John's professors, and I got to go to Quarry Bank Grammar, John's high school, and talk with the headmaster and see the infraction book, where John every day was getting either caned or had leaf duty or garbage duty or what. I mean, every single day, John Lennon, John Lennon, John Lennon, John Lennon. That was cool to get to see that. I tried to get to talk to everyone that I could, and thank goodness, because many of them now, like Bob Wooler and Alan Williams, are gone. Beryl Adams, these people are gone. And I was really blessed. When I went over the first time, Edward, all of the original things were there. They had not remodeled the Grapes, which they have now. The Grapes, the Blue Dell fireplace is gone. The corkscrew tables are gone. Everything that the Beatles would have seen is gone. It's remodeled to be a nautical theme. Now the White Star is still the same, but the Grapes is not. And I got to see the old Dutch cafe where Pete Shotton worked. one of his jobs. He was a policeman and ran the Old Dutch, and it was magical. It was just magical. And the people of Liverpool got involved, and they started helping me. They'd say, "Send me your chapters and we'll correct them for you." And so that was part of the writing process, was sending them to people like Bill Harry, who's always been so generous with his time. And Bill would say, "Well, yeah, you got me in the wrong room at Ye Crack. You need to put me in the back room. You need to put me under the painting of Lord Nelson. And you got me drinking ale. I only drank bitters." How can you do that? The people of Liverpool, June Furlong, the life model at Liverpool College of Art, he was like, "Oh, Jude, you don't have the tendril on the left side of my hair. Oh, don't." And she would just, give me this whole, I wish, Scott, you could have met her, because she was just, she would repeat words at really high pitched, and you could probably watch videos of her. They do have videos of she'll say, one of her famous videos, she says, "I'm June Furlong, I'm famous, as everyone knows." And she corrected my chapters. Oh man, did she correct them? Change this, change this, change this. Yes, I love people that correct things, because I want to get it right. And they all pitched in, they all helped. And it was, it was years after that. I did not, it was probably 8 or 9 years before the first book came out. And that's, ever since then, I've been doing like every 3.5 to 4 years a book. But it becomes increasingly difficult, because when you're young and you have a little tiny place that you live in, a little tiny yard, and you don't have a lot of responsibilities, you can write. But the more things you get, life is what happens while you're busy making other plans. So it's become more and more difficult, because I need a gardener, and I need someone to take care of the house. I need someone to grocery shop, and I need someone to cook, and it ain't happening.
That could
That's a
be.
long story.
Oh, that's a lot. That's a lot of responsibility. And it kind of leads to my next question. So, Scott, kind of a similar question, so how did your voice acting career start? I looked up on your website. Of course, you've done like Civil War, mystery, all sorts of things with history as well, outside of the Beatles. But how did it kind of all kick off for you and start for you? I know you alluded to that a little bit.
Well, when I first started, I worked for a corporation where I was a trainer, and I'd gotten experience basically doing in-person trainings and then recorded trainings. And so that's where I learned how to edit audio and how to record audio in the first place. And also basically editing video and things like that. I then made some videos, how-tos on how to use the corporate um, client-facing websites for navigation and things like that. And we put that out on YouTube, and I was very proud of that. And then later, we had layoffs, and they closed the office that I'd worked in. And then COVID had happened, and I decided I wanted to segue into trying to do the creative thing that I really liked full time for myself, as opposed to for another company with different goals in mind. I didn't mind doing what I'd doing. I liked the company that I'd worked for, outside of the fact of them laying me off. But I wanted to do something that meant something to someone in more of a lasting way. And I was a bookstore manager for many years before the corporate job. And I love books, and I love hearing books read aloud well. And certainly, I'm the kind of person who gets frustrated when I hear somebody having a problem getting a sentence out correctly. And I thought, I could probably do a little bit better than that. And so the first book that I got, and I auditioned for it, was a mystery, a true crime mystery called Crime Components by Renee Winters. Her name is spelled Rena, but she pronounces it Renee, just like Walk Away, Renee. And that I think I did pretty good with that. And I did the sequel for it as well, and called Deadly Deception. And I and that's when Jay Bergen's book came along. In between all of that, I was also doing voice acting for some audio dramas like Madison on the Air and Project Audion, and just getting into as many different kind of things as I could because I have a lot of different interests, and I'd like to do something audio related with all of those. But trust me when I say that having a Beatles project to do as one of the first things on my bucket list of subjects, never ever thought I'd get anywhere near something that was good to do, worthy of doing at anywhere within like the first 7 years of doing this. So I was dead chuffed, as they say, to do, you know, Jay Bergen's book and then having Jude's as well, which is so it's so long. It's like I don't know. I've read Beatle books in the past where they get you all excited. There's all the wind up. You know, as a Beatle fan, you know this. You're like, okay, they're getting good. They're getting better. They go to Hamburg. They come back. They're getting more popular in England. Beatlemania is starting to grow, and you're just waiting for everything to pop. And then, whatever book it always comes down to. And then they toured a lot for 3 years, and then they go right into Sergeant Pepper, and I'm like,
Yeah.
what was it like outside of Busy? And they just sort of dropped it. Jude covered that
Yes.
in detail because I'd always wanted to know, well, what was it actually like outside of a blur or a hurricane, for instance? And that's one of the reasons I really liked Jude's book was the detail and the amount of dialogue in there to do. Because as a narrator, I like doing both the narrator voice and even in a history book, there's always something being quoted that you can do something with to get people to pay attention. And so there's a
Exactly.
challenge to it that I really liked. And boy, did you ever give me a challenge, Jude, with the number of voices. Because, you know, when we went into this, she liked my John Lennon impersonation. She said, and I'm like, well, I could pretty much do the other Beatles. Some I do better than others.
Mhm.
I really had no intention of trying to do all of the voices that anybody might recognize and doing it well. But you know, you do one voice at a time,
Yeah.
and I've researched the voices individually to try to get comfortably close without going into parody if I possibly could.
I was going to read y'all this. I've already sent this to Scott, but I've read a review. I was looking for an audiobook to read, and I always read the reviews before I select the book. And so I come upon this book that looks like it's really interesting. It's about a make-believe rock and roll band who goes on tour, and David Mitchell is the guy that wrote it, and the person's doing the review, and they said David Mitchell is an extraordinary writer. And I was so excited that he had published another book. But the narrator, there are lots of characters with many different accents, a tall order. This should never have been commissioned with only one narrator. At the very least, it needed a female voice. And it goes on and on and on about how the narrator was over his head. And that narrator had to do 25 voices. Scott had to do 183.
Wow.
180.
Well, I count them whenever I start doing an audiobook just to see how many different voices there need to be. And then I decide which are the ones that I have to have a full, detailed background voice and which ones, like, you know, a news reporter or something, that may not need an accurate presentation and I can use just a generic accent or have the voice mimic the headline style.
Okay.
So it's not a full 180 people that I have to, like, you know, there are a lot of times where you just have reporters and some of them don't have names, and that makes it a little easier to just combine them. But yeah, there's at least some juicy parts in there too.
Definitely. Well, and one of the things I notice is with in the book, I mean, looking over, you know, particularly the volume 5 that I have, you know, Bill Harry's London, basically his background, the map of where everything was, Jude, as you described it, where you're going in, and me as an American, I've been to London, I have yet to make the trek to Liverpool, going through and going, okay, this is where everything is actually in relation to each other, how close or how far away it was. I love that as kind of a very good detail. And I guess, one of the other questions I kind of had in the back of my mind, of course, is okay, so there's planned 9 volumes. Where is kind of the future of the series going? Is it going to be more expanded like this, year upon year? Is it going to be more condensed again? And how far do you plan to take it out to 1970 towards its whole life?
I'll tell you the way it was planned, and I don't know that we're going to be able to do that. But first of all, Shades of Life was supposed to be all of 1965 and part of 1966. But when I got to August of 1965, and they're getting ready to come to America for the 65 North American tour, and we've already got 800 pages, like, if I keep going, somebody for sure is going to sue me for carpal tunnel because they can't hold this book. It's going to be too much. And so I cut it off there. And I had to do a part 2, which is what this new book is going to be. It's Shades of Life Part 2. We're going to call it Some Forever. So they have different names. It's not confusing, but it's the end of that book. So it's going to be the end of 65 up to the day that the Beatles play Candlestick. And the final quote of the book is George Harrison's, "Right then, I'm not a Beatle anymore." So that's it. Then she said it's supposed to be that day, from that day up until September of 1969. Yeah, I don't, hopefully that would work. We'll see. Strawberry Fields is supposed to be the early 1970s up to the quote unquote lost weekend, which was neither a weekend nor lost. It was a very rich and important time in John's life. Surprise, surprise is supposed to be May of 1973 until January of 1975. Steel and Glass, January 75 through 78, and Shine On 78 through December of 1980. Will that happen? I do not know. I'm doing the best I can.
No, and I mean, with everything, and of course, this leads kind of into my next question with Scott. I mean, of course, you're doing so much research and, you're citing your sources, which I love, by the way, the citing of the sources, the QR codes is kind of really interactive for a 21st century audience versus myself as a Gen X, where 30 years ago I would have gotten a book. It's just, rather straight ahead, autobiography or chronological, and nothing wrong with those. So Scott, kind of with your doing voices, and especially you're doing John's voice throughout his lifetime, are you kind of listening to
Yes.
clip at that time? So kind of like the difference between, let's say, for example, in 1965, John would have sounded versus John of 1980 with a little more of an American-ness to his voice.
Actually, yes. I very specifically did that. So when I was getting ready for the She Loves You readings and recordings and retakes, I listened only to, at all possible 1963 recordings, whether they were audio or video or both, and try to avoid any of the later ones. Just like when I did Jay Bergen's book, I only listened to John Lennon recordings from 1975. Fortunately, there was enough of those, especially with the gray whistle, the old gray whistle test interview, the long form one, that helped with that. And yes, his voice does change. You're very correct. Yeah. And so, yeah, I tried to do that where possible. The hardest part was probably Cynthia Lennon, because almost every interview you'll find with her, at least on YouTube, almost all of those are post 1980. And I was lucky to find one that was posted from actually mid 1964 or 1965 with her talking to baby Julian. And just very adorable. I don't know who recorded it. I think it might have been George. Brought a tape recorder over or something, and she's like, "Hey, little baby, you know," and very, very sweet and gentle. I'm like, that's the voice I should be doing. That's a much more clear voice of the style that she would have been talking back at that time.
And that was crucial because, the book, the one that we did, She Loves You, is Cynthia's book. I mean, the title, She Loves You, the book is dedicated to her. And she is throughout the book because this is John and Cynthia's honeymoon in September of 1963 when they go to Paris. This is her going with him to America for the Ed Sullivan Show and the Carnegie Hall and the whole bit, Miami and everything. She's a very integral part of the book. So, I mean, I was concerned. I was like, if someone can do that deep voice of John Lennon, is it possible for them to do Cynthia? And I told Scott from the get-go, I'm worried about this. And he's like, I can do this. And sure enough, he did.
Excellent. No, and it is funny, with the different accents, like I said, with the John of 1965 versus John 1980, for example, or the mid 70s, or like you said, the early 60s as well, kind of listening how all of our voices, of course, change over
Yeah.
time. And I love that, Jude, in your book, again, going a little bit more in depth with like the QR codes and again, really bringing the reader in. How did you really set those up? I mean, obviously I'm thinking you're setting it up around the venue or around the time period, but like the process of doing that within a book and integrating that into the narrative, into the biography of it, into the voice work.
Well, first of all, I don't take any credit for that. My husband does all the technical work in the book. He's the first editor before it goes to my professional editors, and he finds tons of things that need to be changed and improved. He does all the business side of the house, the ISBN, the Library of Congress. Of course, he did the art for the covers of all the books. And he got the QR codes and is still doing that. But that idea came from Ruth McCartney. Ruth said, Jude, if you're describing a concert, you need to then at the end of the chapter have a QR code and let people watch the concert. If you're giving people a press conference, then you need to have a QR code and let people watch the press conference. I'm like, oh yes, that's brilliant. I mean, I even know what a QR code was. That lady is a technological genius. And she's always, I met Ruth in 1993 at Beatle, I'm trying to think what they called it. It was like Beatle something.
Yeah, Beatle Fest maybe, or
It was in Kansas City. I can't remember what they called it, but I was her chaperone. And it's a great story. If we can get off, can we get off the subject for 1 second?
Go for it.
I go to pick her up at her hotel. It's 2 blocks. She's at the Mulebach where the Beatles stayed. And it's 2 blocks from the convention center. And I go and her hotel door is open and I kind of knocked on the door. She's like, come in, and she has on this lovely, what I think is a purple slip. It was obviously a slip dress because she puts her purple high heels on and she's all dolled up and ready to go. And we get in the elevator and she's telling me about her crush on Donny Osmond and all this kind of stuff. She got the slip on. And so we walk outside to walk to the convention center, and they're having a Cinco de Mayo festival. And they're like 1 million guys at the Cinco de Mayo festival. And I'm her, I mean, so guys were yelling at her and screaming at her, and she was just waving and walking on by. And I'm thinking, if this goes wrong,
yeah, I can see where that might take a rough turn.
I was an aerobics instructor. What was I going to do? Jump and jack people to death, So, but we made it there. And the next day, I had to take her to a television station to do an interview. So we spent a lot of time together. And she has always been extremely supportive and helpful, as have everybody else. I mean, Julia Baird, really so supportive, like a sister. And Louise Harrison, when Louise was alive, she was very helpful. I've been blessed. There have been a lot of people who've this isn't something you can do by yourself, for sure.
Yes, that's, whether it's Lewison, yourself, anybody. I mean, you definitely, it's definitely a lot of preparation. I'm sure, again, Scott, as you just described with your preparation, and Jude, your preparation as well. And just kind of again, with the research and stuff. So you said, it takes 3 to 4 years with the research, which is amazing. I want to go into a little side story, and this one is actually from the volume 5. So this is from the volume 5 that I got, the one that I got at the fest, which it was awesome to meet you both at the fest, by the way. I had a lovely time at the fest. It was my first in-person one in about 22 years or something like that. So page 270.
Really?
Yeah. First in-person one in about 22 years. I've done a couple virtual ones, but it was nice. So I promise it's not going to be another 22 years for my next in-person one. I'm trying to plan for next year, New York at least. I'm still little bit of cash, strap from this past one. So there's the Mark Vidala story, page 270. He's in the Bahamas with John. I'm going to throw this out there a little bit, maybe a little bit of a curveball, but hopefully not. Kind of describing not only writing the scene, getting the memory down, but of course, voicing it as well, Scott. So this is kind of a question for both of you.
Yeah, well, I was very fortunate to use one of the best websites that any Beatles fan can go to. It's meetthebeatlesforreal.com. Sarah Schmidt's wonderful site. The way I operate on taking notes, I will go to all the, I start off with Lewison, of course, all of his books, and then the anthology, and then I start digging into Coleman and Badman and Womack and Spicer, and I do all that. When I'm finished, when I've compiled, these are the notes on Buckingham Palace. When I'm finished, then I go to meetthebeatlesforreal.com, because Sarah always has a story that you can't find anywhere else. And the story of Mark was on Meet the Beatles for Real. And it had been picked up by Beatle Fan magazine. And a reporter for Beatle Fan worked with Sarah, and Mark was alive at that time, and worked with Mark and did a story for Beatle Fan. And so with those two, I wasn't going to get much more. Mark passed away a few years ago. And but Sarah was very helpful with what he was like, what he looked like, what he acted like. And actually, Mark Lewison was able, I reached out to Mark's surviving family and did not hear back from them, but Mark Lewison did, and he was well aware of the story of Mark. It's just such a touching, sweet story. And he for everyone that hasn't read Shades of Life Part 1, he was an extra in the Bahamas in the making of Help. And he was down there visiting his mom after graduating from high school. I think his dad sent him there to get him out of his hair. And he's hanging out in his mother's law office, sitting in the conference room, reading magazines, and go to the movie at night. He was bored. He's a high school student. He's bored. And one of the lawyers at the firm where his mom works comes in and says, "Hey, they're having auditions for extras for a movie. Why don't you go over there and try out?" And he gets to be, he's accepted as one of Klang's baddies that are going to be on the beach in the Bahamas. And he goes, for the rehearsal, and gets his costume and starts hanging out on the beach, and decides he's going to chat up the Beatles. And it's a high school kid. So George Harrison tells him to bugger off, which I can see. He don't want to be bugged by this kid. And Paul, kind of talks to him and brushes him aside. And John hangs out with him, and he talks to him, for a long time. And the guy Mark Vidala spills his sob story of the fact that they told him that he could get cut from the film, but he's going to make sure that his friends know that he's in the film. So at the very end, when they're walking down the beach and the camera is focused right on him, he goes and gives it a thumbs up and looks right into the camera, which they told him not to do. Don't look into the camera. So John's like, all right, you're going to, I wish I could talk like Scott. Yeah, you're going to be cut from the film. Unfortunately, you're gone, son. And so Mark's like, what? And John says, there's only one thing for it. We'll have to have a picture made together so you can prove to your friends that you know me. It's John's suggestion. And there's a great color photo of the two of them standing on the beach. And it's a photo that I'm sure John completely forgot about, it didn't register with him. But his kindness to that kid and the fact that he suggested that they get that picture made together was one of the things that they mentioned in Mark's obituary, that it had meant that much to him. So it's for a world that is becoming increasingly John Lennon critical, and saying, oh, he was not a good father, and oh, he was this, and oh, he was that. He was one heck of a nice guy, to tell you the honest truth. And that bears it out. I have hundreds of stories like that, but that's one of my favorites.
And like you said, you're not picking up on it. It goes against that whole narrative of, well, John was always the wisecracking. Well, no, not even throughout his whole life. And even as he aged from, his 20s to 40, which he was taken way too soon, obviously, where he was going, that type of thing. Yeah, it goes against that whole thing. I'm glad you were able to write in this style, which really brings him to life. So, Mark, how would it Mark, oh my goodness. I was thinking Mark Lewison. Scott, I apologize. I'm calling you
Well,
Mark
I'm
Lewison now.
flattered beyond all means. Yeah.
Mark, there we go. We'll keep that in. But you know what? So
Yeah.
Scott, so how is it, kind of voicing that whole scene? So if you want to give a little sample, you're certainly welcome to whatever you feel comfortable with.
Well, I haven't recorded that particular book. I've only done
Okay.
She Loves You right
Okay.
now. And so I can do a scene for you from She Loves You. I have the book with the scene in it, but I haven't practiced it, and I'd need to do a good voice for Mark, and I'd have to think about it for a little bit. Um, and I don't know if you wanted me to do that, but otherwise I'll be happy to do the She Loves You piece instead.
No,
Is that
no, no,
okay?
go for that. I was going to say go for the She Love You. Please we go with the strengths here. We go with that. So please feel free to.
Okay. Well, I don't mind impromptu stuff either, but uh, I don't know how much editing of the recording you like to do before you post the videos, as it were. So anyway, so I've got a selection for you from She Loves You, and it's the four Beatles talking about what's going to happen with their music since Capitol is passed on them, and there's problems with VJ, aren't there? And so they're wondering about who's going to be releasing She Loves You. And anyway, so we're in the office with the Beatles and with Brian Epstein, later Epstein, and also with Tony Barrow, if I'm not mistaken. And so Paul is saying, so these are the labels then? Paul raised an eyebrow as he blew ripples across his tea. Have we narrowed in on the best ones? Made contact? Do we know? Slow down, son, John interrupted him. You're liable to lose your license at that rate. The four boys spurted tea and sneered over Paul's recent loss of his driver's license for speeds exceeding 55 miles per hour in a slow zone. Only Paul and Brian found the jibe humorless. Our options, Brian moved on without response, have been weighed carefully for several weeks, and considering the marvelous success of Philadelphia artists such as Frankie Avalon, Fabian, and Bobby Rydell, it was the opinion of George, Martin, of course. But I didn't think it was me, George Harrison muttered. The others grinned. George thought that approaching an established Philadelphia-based company might be apropos, the right entry point into America, as it were. Philadelphia promoters appeared to have discovered a proven formula, a pathway to hit records, so to speak. Sounds reasonable, John thought. But then what do I know? Could be hocus pocus for all I know. And that Philadelphia company would be, John rolled a finger for Brian to continue, Swan Records. Brian let the word sink in. It's a relatively small company, operated by Mr. Bernie Binnick and a Mr. Tony Mamarella. However, interestingly enough, a rather well-known young American television host named Dick Clark. Oh, of American Bandstand. George eagerly filled in the blanks. Having a sister in America kept him abreast of trends in the States. Yes, Dick Clark of American Bandstand was once a co-owner in Swan's operation. Brian nodded. Though with the recent government investigation into payola, good old payola. John rubbed his fingers together greedily. Mr. Clark voluntarily sold his interest in Swan to avoid any hint of impropriety, any conflict of interests. So say we go with Swan. George sat up in his chair and placed his teacup upon Brian's desk. Will that mean that Dick Clark might agree to play our songs then on American Bandstand? I mean, now, now that he's no longer really with the organization and all. Well, uh, Brian conceded. George Martin heard that Mr. Clark's still close friends with Swan's owners. Oh, but DJ, Paul frowned. We still have some sort of leasing agreement with them, don't we? You know, some sort of tie for years and years, right? About VJ being sent a notice of termination. And long story short, you're now free of any entanglement with VJ. Great, good. Ringo wagged his head. Oh, good man, Marshal. Paul smiled. John and George simply nodded. But what I need to know, Brian stopped pacing and stood before them, is if you're open to pursuing this new relationship with Swan. Well, John's already married, Paul quipped. And Maureen's practically got me walking down the aisle. Ringo shrugged. Well, I'm all for it. George kept business. Where do we sign, Sonny Jim? John whisked one of the pens off of Brian's desk.
Yay!
First of all, I felt like I was in the room, and this is not, just no exaggeration, nothing like that. I mean, just sitting there listening to all the different voices. Thank you, Scott. Wow, and this is the things you can look forward to, obviously, in the books.